Imagine you're on the verge of retirement, the moment you've been working for your whole life. You're standing on a cliff looking out into an uncertain future with one question on your mind. Will you have enough to retire? Will you have enough to make it until the end? Consider two people, Bob and Sam. Bob and Sam start off with about $1 million in retirement funds. Over the course of their retirements, they follow two different paths. Here's the crazy thing though. Even though at the end, when Bob has way more money than Sam, they both earned about 10% on average. What happened? Well, with a technique called Monte Carlo simulation, we can simulate thousands of possible retirements and we can see what happens, how two people can possibly end up with such different results. Here's how it happened though. Over the course of the 30 years, while they averaged 10% each, they had very different yearly annual returns. Specifically, they had different returns early on in their retirement. Bob had much greater returns in his first few years, which gave him a cushion to withstand some of the later downswings. I like Dave Ramsey. I agree with him about a lot of things, but I will say when it comes to this particular topic, he gets it pretty wrong. He talks about how the market averages 12% or whatever, and as if we should just copy paste 12% into our spreadsheet and be done with it. It's just not that simple. Physicist Stanislaw Ulam came up with the Monte Carlo method as a way to model complex reactions, like, for example, nuclear reactions. By simulating an output thousands of times and then looking at the statistics that come out of that data, we can make better informed decisions about how the phenomenon behaves in the real world. Sam Savage, in his excellent book, The Flaw of Averages, says it this way: plans based on averages are wrong on average. Let that sink in. In 1998, three professors from Trinity University conducted the now famous Trinity study. It looked at what would be a safe withdrawal rate for a portfolio over various time periods and with various levels of stock and bond mixes. The Trinity study was interesting. It looked at data from 1926 to 1995. It would take overlapping time periods. For example, from 1930 to 1944 was one 15-year time period. 1931 to 1945 would be another 15-year period, and so on. They looked at all these possible 15-year periods, 20-year periods, 25-year periods, and even 30-year periods over the course of the entire era from 1926 to 1995, tested various withdrawal rates and stock and bond mixes. They produced many tables like this with the withdrawal rate in the column headers and the payout period or the length of retirement in the row headers. I've reproduced a couple of these in my Excel model, and I'll show those to you in a minute. The output of the Trinity study was the now famous 4% rule. They don't exactly say 4%. They say a couple other things, that it should be about 4%, maybe 3%. And it's important to point out that there are many variations on this data. They looked at the data from 1926 to 1995. They also looked at it from 1946 to 1995. They did not have the data from obviously the 2000s, the financial crisis, and so on in their analysis. Okay, so how do we do this with Excel? I'm going to walk through this spreadsheet. For those of you who are Excel inclined, this may seem somewhat understandable. It shouldn't be too complicated. For those of you who are not very Excel savvy, we'll go through this in a fairly quick order, probably a few minutes, and then we'll get on to the results. But I want to at least give the basics on how the Excel part works. Okay, let's start with the inputs. Up here on the upper left-hand side, you can see these are the user inputs, and they should hopefully be very self-explanatory. Starting balance, your initial withdrawal rate, the length of the retirement, the percentage of your investments that will go to stocks, and the inflation rate. I also give the user the ability to change from corporate bonds to government treasuries, etc. The analysis conducted by the Trinity professors were done with corporate bonds, I should add. If you're in an index fund, like a Vanguard target fund, you're probably going to be in some mix of government bonds and corporate bonds. I think in my Vanguard target fund, it's about 2/3 US government and then like about a third corporate. Okay, the fields of interest here are what they call the terminal balance, which is essentially how much money you'll have when you die, and the portfolio success rate, which is what percentage of the portfolios would have survived until the end. As you can see here, a very common scenario would probably be 4% withdrawal over 30 years with 50/50 stocks and bonds. In that case, we can see that the portfolio had a success rate of 92%, and the person would die with about $5.8 million. Okay. Okay, so how do we build this thing? We have the user inputs here. I'm going to go kind of row by row fairly quickly for the Excel folks. And again, those who are not into Excel or don't want to get into the details, just hang on for a few minutes and we'll get to the results later. Okay, so the first cell is simply, we're taking the starting balance from cell D4, right? Withdrawal is pretty simple. It's just the initial withdrawal rate times the starting balance. Balance after withdrawal is self-explanatory. It's just the starting balance minus the withdrawal amount. We're assuming that you're taking out your money at the beginning of the year. The S&P investment is going to be the percentage going to stocks times the balance after withdrawal. Bonds will be what's left over. Same thing. Then what we're going to do is we're going to pull a random year out of history, right? In this case, we're using the rand between function between 1928 and 2023, the data for which I have the available returns. I want to point out that there's another way to do this. You can create a random number this way. I'll show you here with the rand. I'm going to point this out for those who may not have seen this before. I'm going to do an equals norm inv rand, and then my mean, and then standard deviation. And then I'll get a random number like this. And this is going to give us a normally distributed random number that would roughly approximate the S&P 500. I could have done this and just, be done with it. But this method that I'm using of pulling a random year from actual history and bringing in those numbers, I am basically stealing from another website. I think it was Vanguard or Fidelity some years ago had a simulator that used a very similar method to this. And I thought that was pretty clever. So here we go. So we pull out that random year, bring its stock and bond returns. You'll note that the bond formula is a little more complicated because we're giving the user the chance to choose between multiple other investment types. Our stock return is simply the percentage return times the amount of money invested in stocks. Bond return, same thing. And hold on, the computer's thinking for a second there. And then the end balance is obviously the stock and bond returns plus the balance after withdrawal at the beginning of the year. The starting balance for year two is going to be pretty similar. The difference is going to be that the starting balance is simply the end balance from year one. The withdrawal amount is going to be the previous year's withdrawal amount times the inflation rate. And then everything else is going to be basically the same. From there, we're going to take year two, essentially this whole structure here, and we're just going to copy paste it 28 more times until we get 30 years of simulated retirement. So that whole row there is essentially one simulated retirement, right? It's one imaginary person who retired and got these random returns over the course of 30 years using all the inputs we talked about. We then take that row, and there's no need for VBA or doing anything too sexy. We just go and take that row and we copy it 10,000 times. So you can see here at the very end, we're down at row 10,012. We've got 10,000 simulated retirements. And that's enough to give us a very robust look at some of these things we talked about, the portfolio success rate and the terminal balance, right? So the question is, after all this jiggery-pokery with Excel, what do we end up with? Now we'll get to the tables here. The first one is, by the way, your first temptation when you finish building something like this is to start just kind of fiddling around with some of these inputs, right? What if I change this to 5%? Let's see, if I change it to 5%, My portfolio success rate drops down to 77%, for example. Hey, what if I put 100% in stocks? What happens there? My portfolio success rate actually goes down, but my terminal balance goes up quite a bit, et cetera, et cetera. So you're going to want to keep fiddling around with these things and noodling with it. This is an excellent case for a data table. So that's what we have here. Along the top row, we have um, the stock mix, and along the row headers, we've got the withdrawal rate. And you can see our kind of standard 50% stocks, 4% withdrawal rate ends with the final balance of about 5.8 million. What's interesting is a slight deviation. I mean, just going from 4% to 5% goes from 5.8 million to 3.7 million. So you're going to lose about $2 million just by taking 1% more as a starting balance. On the other hand, if you take 1% less, you end up gaining about $2 million. I love my kids, but I also want to enjoy the money that I work for. So my goal is not to be, this guy who dies with $20 million and probably doesn't enjoy his retirement as much. The other table that's interesting is quite kind of the opposite question. If the top table is how can we maximize our terminal balance, how much we essentially die with, the bottom table is how can we minimize our risk? What's the lowest risk mix of stock and bonds for any given withdrawal rate? So again, the standard 4% withdrawal rate, this data shows that the least risky over 30 years is a 30% equities and then 70% bonds. The Trinity study data would probably disagree with this one a little bit, and that could be because it didn't have the 2000s. The 2000s were a terrible time, as you all know, and even the last few years have been a little weird. So I don't know. This is a bit strange. But if you're, if you're going to put all your money into equities, and I should say, if you're going to take a lot of money out, you want to put it all into equities. That's your best chance. On the other hand, the absolute safest path you can take is just to take 2% and then just put all your money in bonds. A person with this scenario would basically be guaranteed to never go broke. Okay, and there's two more tables I want to talk about because I wanted to replicate one of the tables from the Trinity study. That Trinity study has a lot of these tables. There's many of them in there, and I replicated this one, which is simply 100% into stocks, the withdrawal rate, and the payout period. The withdrawal rate being column headers, payout period being row headers. And you can see their results here on the bottom, and then mine on the top. And I was kind of surprised, given that these are two completely different methods, how similar many of them are. I mean, in some cases, they're almost right on the money. And again, they only had data up till 1995, and mine goes all the way to 2023. So I thought this was kind of an interesting thing. The place where they really differ a bit is here at the kind of the margins, the really extreme case of living, 30 years and taking 12%. In my case, I have 8% survival rate and they have 15, but a lot of these are surprisingly close. So this table is well worth looking at. What I might want to do is duplicate the rest of the Trinity study tables as a future video and then share that with everybody if there's any interest. Well, that's it. That is how to build a stock simulator in Excel. If you're an Excel person, this is probably pretty simple. If you are not, then might seem a little bit wonky. But the bottom line is, I think the good news is that you can build something like this on your own at home. It kind of reaffirms some of the Trinity study thinking. And if you're savvy enough to build one of these, I think you can do a lot of experimentation and kind of learn more about how this works and make better informed decisions for your own retirement. Again, the obligatory, if you like this, give it a thumbs up, make a comment, subscribe, etc. This is my second video, so I'm sure it's going to be kind of lame, but I'm learning as I go, and I'm hoping to put more of these out. Thanks so much.